everybody. Welcome to our very first No Spoon show, Google Hangout. We've previously been using the conference call platform and podcast platform and switching over to Google Hangout and see how it goes for a couple of episodes of our show. And tonight we'll be talking about guns and mental health, the big issues that you've been hearing about in the media. We've been having hearings in the House and in the Senate on gun policies, on mental health issues. And so we've brought 5 distinguished guests today to talk more about these issues. And we're going to start off by speaking with Kaiser Hussein and Mariam Khwaja, who are mental health experts, as I like to call them. Mariam is a therapist, licensed therapist in New York City, and Kaiser is a public health professional in D.C. who's organizing several events on mental health with the Department of Health and Human Services and also the Muslim community, which he represents through the American Muslim Health Professionals Network. Later we'll be having Fuad and Reggie from No Spoon blog, from There Is No Spoon, joining us to talk more specifically about the guns debate. So I want to get started with Kaiser and Mariam talking about mental health. And my first question to you is, how do you actually define mental health? Mariam, let's start with you.
Mental health is, your emotional well-being, right? Your mental and emotional state. Just as we have to take care of our physical health and our physical bodies, through diet and exercise and doctor checkup, there's also our internal state, which is, some of it is shaped by the temperament and that you were born with, but also environmental factors that influence and shape how we internalize things, and then how we then deal and process with things that happen in our everyday life.
Great. Kaiser, what would you say?
I think that was a great response. I think the notion that we're focused on well-being and this broader terminology, not just the absence of illness, I think that's an important aspect to it. And the fact that oftentimes it just gets short shrift compared to physical well-being. You don't see people stigmatized for not taking care of or not taking medication for diabetes, or asking for treatment as it relates to heart disease. But when you're talking about mental health or counseling, therapy, I mean, those are really stigmatized, particularly in certain communities. I know for a fact in the Muslim community, and we're not totally different from other communities. We still have a lot of barriers. We're just not used to considering it as a legitimate, like a legitimate place for our attention.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So these days, mental health is becoming the hot topic. Everyone's talking about it, and partly it's because it's catapulted into the spotlight because of the connection with gun violence and all of the shootings that are happening. What do you guys think about this connection? Do you think that the highlighting of mental health now, because of its connection to gun violence, is good or bad PR for the field?
I think that it's kind of, I think mental health and the mental health awareness is something that is an issue that has been a long time coming to be focused on, and it sucks that it's been kind of this gun violence kind of has pushed this so much, because I've been working in the field for over 10 years now. I've done a lot of home-based work. I've worked with seriously and emotionally disturbed children, and seeing kids who are so disturbed and so in need of help and services that they could have the potential to do some of the things that have these kind of shooting responses. There is a network of services that is available, and so when those services are in place and they're there in intensive setting and environment, kids can get through this and without having to exhibit violence. They just need support. A lot of these kids come from very troubled homes, and I feel like those things are not being focused on. It just makes it about, because there is a gun or there's shooting, it becomes a highlighted issue. But you know, there's been, for years and years, schools in New York City have had metal detectors and have had lots of police forces in their school, and it's kind of intimidating. Me as someone who's gone as a social worker to visit my students in the schools, I've been intimidated by it. I've been had to, you know, had my bags and everything searched and things like that. So I think it's been an issue here in New York, and we've been kind of accommodating it and kind of really putting services in place, but I hate that it is being connected with the gun violence.
Yeah.
Guys, you've been organizing a lot of events on mental health as it relates to mental health policy. Do you find now that the forums and discussions that you are organizing are being usurped by the gun violence conversation?
No, well, actually, I have to say that it's unfortunate that gun violence has brought mental health the focus and attention, because the intersection is clearly very small. I think only if you look at those who commit gun violence, I think it's only 4% who are mentally ill. However, I have to say that now, because we have this national conversation, it's a bit easier to get the attention on mental health and have people really focused on that. But I have to say, you know, we started this work as an organization, so American Muslim Health Professionals, for the last year. Imam Majid told us it's the #1 public health issue in his mind for the Muslim community. So we've been developing programs around this, and now we're kind of launching into this next phase, and it's good that Muslims and Americans writ large are starting to pay attention to really the lack of access to service, as well as the community stigma, and a big problem that we have, and this is coming from an imam in the DC area. Imams need to learn first to do no harm. They oftentimes are the biggest barriers, and Mariam probably sees this all the time, where imams just either don't understand the gravity of mental illness, or they're not able to triage or identify or ask the right questions, or they consider any sort of mental instability or emotional disturbance as a lack of iman, and through prayer or through tasbih, that person is able to solve all of his or her issues, when, you know, oftentimes that's not simply going to work.
Right. Let's talk about service for a second, because Kaiser, you mentioned, you know, mental health care, mental health services, or the lack thereof. Mariam, what would be in your world, as a therapist, the ideal mental health care, coverage, services that would be offered to the general U.S. population?
Well, it's not, okay, so basically, not everyone needs mental health services, right? So the need for it has to be identified. You identify a problem, is there a child or an individual who is exhibiting problems at home, at work, at school, and if there are these difficulties in their daily functioning, you start off with the least supportive out. Like, you know, you go from bottom up, right? So you try them with therapy, right? There is a connection that is made there. Someone is saying, okay, you know what? You could use some support, you can use some assistance, even at the masjid too, right? So you have imams as well, other community members, right? We can, if we're able to support each other as a family and saying, okay, you know, just like, okay, you look like you have a fever, you need to go to the doctor. You look like you're not well, you look like you're not depressed. How can we get you some help, right? And then so identifying, helping to connect people who might need some help with resources, right? So you start on the basic level is therapy, right? And if that is not sufficient, there are other services that are in place that is provided through the mental health system in the U.S. Right? So in New York City, I'm going to use the children's mental health cycle here or the mental health system in New York City as an example. So if therapy is not sufficient and kids are still exhibiting problems, you can have teachers, imams, therapists themselves saying, okay, this child might need more services. We can apply for them to get a little bit more intensive services. So then you can make an application and children can receive home-based services in which therapists or social workers come to the home and they monitor how the child is doing. And depending on if that is sufficient in kind of maintaining stability for the child and helping the child to develop the necessary coping skills to deal with problems and stressors in a healthy way or in a non-destructive way, then that's good. But then you can increase them in intensity. And I've worked with kids who have been like violent towards animals at a young age, doing fire setting and things like that. And if there are those behaviors that are there, that we don't ignore them, that we know what the red flags are, and we get them the help that they need. And if these children need to go to the hospital to get appropriately medicated or get that appropriate treatment, or if they need to go to be in a residential placement for a time being to ensure their safety and the safety of others, we need to be open and accepting of those things to ensure their safety, the individual safety, and also the safety of the community and society.
That brings up a lot of interesting points, and I want to actually bring Fouad into the discussion right now, since he's our very passionate voice on racial issues. Don't you think it's a little dangerous to have anyone participate in the diagnosing of someone's mental health issues? And what are the potential racial implications of looking to community members, for example, as people who identify someone with a mental health problem?
I'm sorry, the issues with what?
The issues with, Mariam talked about how community members or faith leaders, basically non-professionals, can be utilized in identifying someone who has a mental health issue. Well, my concern would be, okay, if you're having non-professionals determine, this Fouad, for example, has a mental health problem, how do I know that non-professional is not being biased because of something that they have against Fouad?
I think that you need multiple levels for a system like this for it to work. The real story is part of the real story with mental health is just our system in America in terms of treating mental health illness is really inadequate, right? And the ideal type of situation that I think you would have, as we've already discussed a little bit, you'd have more community involvement. Yeah, so I think that it could be a useful first step into the process, but along with that, we need larger education of these communities on these issues. And let's be real, mental health illness in America is still a bit of a taboo topic. We've been for years there's been a big effort for mental health parity in terms of bills that have gone through Congress and don't get passed. So I think that just the understanding of what these conditions are and sort of how to treat them, it's at a pretty bad level, right? So I think that you would need multiple steps for that to work out. I do think there are some advantages within with an educated community that are particularly helpful, because a lot of the issues that shape some of these things are related to community type problem. The things that are related to poverty and other social and demographic issues. I think community members might be able to understand that perhaps a little bit better, but they need to know more about mental health themselves. So I think in the end of the day, it still points back to the issue of, we need better education on this topic, period. And then I think the community level could be useful in terms of getting people into the system. But, oh, by the way, it's not that clear that folks are going to be able to access some sort of real healthcare system to take care of their mental health illnesses. So it's a problem on many levels, I think.
If I could just add a point to what Fuad was saying, in terms of getting the community involved, I recently learned about this certification program called Mental Health First Aid or something like that. But I thought, so this is a program that's been running for like 2 years. It's funded out of the state departments of mental health from Missouri and from Maryland. And the notion is you go through a 10-hour intensive training course as a family or as a community member. Maybe you're a member of the clergy, or someone who sees a lot of people day in and day out. And after that certification, you're now able to at least ask the right questions or start identifying people to be able to be better at triaging. And I think that's the sort of broad community-based education that we need if we're going to start to have the mental health parity and actually prevent biases.
Great.
So I'd also like to clarify, because your question, Fatma, came out of a comment that I had made. When it comes to the community members, I think if you look at all the interviews that have been done, say after the VCU kind of shooting and everything, and the more recent one in Connecticut, you'll have a lot of people who, in the interview, saying there was something odd about this person's behavior. And there was a detection of something strange, but no one said anything about it. No one did anything about it. No one reported it. So I think it's the onus on a community member is not to diagnose and to do that, but it's just to kind of bring attention to it. And you can do that in two ways. One, speaking to the individual directly and saying, "Are you okay?" And kind of making them aware that there's help out there, but also then to consult with other community members or leaders, I should say, and say, I'm concerned about something here, right? And then they're on the radar, and you have certain people who are more trained and who have that professional, background, who can go and kind of just even ask and even seek out that, rather than just letting this problem fester and grow and escalate into something that can be potentially more dangerous.
Now that we have Reggie Miller from No Spoon on with us, I want to switch the discussion to the gun debate. And Reggie, just ask you, generally, what do you think is the real thing being debated by these two sides?
If folks aren't really talking about issues of violence or issues of guns here, because if that was the issue, you wouldn't have people like the folks from the NRA saying things like, we need to look at things like video games, or we need to look at popular music or popular TV or things of that nature. Because if that was the case, if those were the things that were causing all of these sort of shootings and all of these mass shootings in places like schools and things of that nature, these things, we wouldn't have had these issues, or we wouldn't have started to have any of these kinds of issues, or we wouldn't have had gun violence at all up until the advent of things like rap music, or the things like violence in movies, or things like violence on TV shows, which obviously is not the case. We might not have had them be as public or as publicized as they are now. We might not have had them be as, for lack of a better term, common as they've turned out to be now. But, if you look at it, there were guns well before there were video games. There were guns well before there was television. There was guns well before there were, was rap music, or well before there were motion pictures. There were guns. There were people being shot and killed by these guns. Or if you look at different cultures, Japanese makers of most of the video games that are played. Gun violence in Japan, much, much less than there is here. Over in the UK, again, gun violence, much less than it is there. They still play video games there, so it can't just be about video games. There has to be something that is much more, is rooted much more in something else other than just these popular culture excuses. You have to have this tool, you have to have this device, you have to have access to this tool and this device, and you also have to have the desire for one reason or another to want to use it. Whether that's because you're pissed off at the world, or whether it's a more sort of emotional issue, you're trying to find somebody, someplace, somewhere to get some kind of attention to deal with some sort of issue that you may or may not have. there's something to that. So we're not talking about violence. We're not talking about guns. We're not talking about people's right to own weapons. Or at least that's not what we should be having the conversation about anyway. You know, the things that we should be talking about are where and how does this fit into us, particularly us here in the United States, as a culture? Where and what does this have to do with how we interact and deal with one another, and particularly how a larger, and if you look at the folks who are committing these types of crimes by and large, how does this, for lack of a better term again, alienated white male fit into this culture of violence in this particular instance or in this particular case? You know, but that's not something that we want to talk about.
Did anybody get a chance to watch the hearings this week at all? And if you did, what was your impression?
Unfortunately, I didn't. I've been on lockdown at work most of the week.
I read a little about it. That's about all.
All right. What's your impression after reading about them?
I mean, it seemed like it was a show, right? I mean, this is pointing out there's an actual discussion to be had about this issue, but you know, it's like most things that happen in Congress. It's a dog and pony show, right? So you have the NRA staking out one extreme position. The gun control side also isn't necessarily being analytical when discussing some of these issues. I mean, I don't believe that the Second Amendment, you know, allows us to arm ourselves to the teeth by any means, but there's some aspects that you can talk about in a more analytical and proper way than they are. But we're not really getting to the questions we need to be asking properly. You know, I mean, I think in the end of the day, the gun control debate. I mean, there's some things that are very obvious that we should be doing that are no-brainers, and that's like background check kind of stuff. We should be having a real legal debate about, you know, what does the Second Amendment mean, but the courts have already sort of decided upon that. And I think a lot of this is sort of political posturing for the bases, in a sense. And you know, and I think it's also important to remember. I'm not a huge proponent of cultural explanations, but it's important to note that the United States has been an incredibly violent nation throughout its history, incredibly violent. It is much less violent now than it's ever been, right? And I think that that's part of the hype that this debate is going. And you know, I don't mean to minimize the horrific incidents that have happened. That's not at all what I'm saying. But if you do want to talk about, you know, why is it that these incidents and this kind of violence is happening in the U.S. more than any place else? I mean, part of it is, again, we are an incredibly violent nation, have always been, and it's come down a lot. And this level of extreme violence that we see, you know, with Newtown and Aurora, you know, this is kind of things that happen here. I think that that's kind of important to note and understand there is something to violence in America to do with access to weapons and just a historical legacy of just how we handle things. You know, it's I mean, I'd quote Michael Franti. You know, he's got the song where he talks about, you know, you're telling the youth to stop being so violent, but you drop bombs in every single continent, and it's true. You know, it's very hypocritical when we start talking about, you know, well, we need to get tough on violence in America. How's a kid supposed to differentiate, you know, the extreme violence that we perpetuate overseas or domestically? You know, for instance, the NYPD, right? It's difficult to get to that situation. So you know, I think there's a lot to be said about just the violence that is in our society that has nothing to do with things like video games and movies. And you know, yeah, I think they should be a little less violent too, but that's not the story, because lots of other countries have way more violent stuff in terms of that, and they aren't having all these gun crimes going on.
Mariam and Orkaiser, do you guys have anything to say about the gun debate?
I think, you know, from a public health point of view, we need to keep a couple of things in mind. One, the violence that or these mass shootings get a lot of media attention, but really just a fraction of the number of deaths that are occurring on a daily basis in urban cities, and I think we need to be cognizant of that. And I mean, I think there's a racial angle to that as well, right? Most of the people that are dying out on the streets are probably black. It's a lot of black on black violence, and that doesn't get a lot of media attention. But when you break down the numbers, so about 30,000 annual deaths from gun violence every single year, about 60% of that is self-inflicted. So I think when we talk about gun violence, we really need to unpack that and figure out, okay, so a lot of it is suicidal tendencies. Maybe there's a mental health issue component to that, and had they not had such easy access to a gun, maybe their chances of living would be a lot higher. And if we're really interested in public safety, we need some common sense gun laws associated with that. Another aspect that I wanted to point out is that we have 300 million guns in America right now. If we were to enact all of the president's proposed legislation, that still curbs future purchases. It has nothing to do with the guns that are already out on the street, the guns that are legally purchased in people's homes, the ammunition, the large magazine clips. So I don't think that the future of gun violence is actually going to go down as a result of any sort of measures that we're taking here in the short term. But that might just be my bleak perspective.
Reggie, I want to ask you a question specifically. Oh, I'm sorry, Mariam, were you going to say something?
Just a really quick thing that I was going to add was one thing that has not, I'm struck that has not made the debates or any of the dialogue is the fact that kids who are exposed to abuse in the home or in the communities, or it's not just in the community, it's in the homes that we're neglecting as well. Kids from abusive homes are more likely to be more violent in their relationships outside and kind of deal with stress in that violent way. And I think we also need to, as a community, and in the Muslim community, this has become another issue that we don't talk about, is domestic violence. And I think that needs to also be on the forefront, where we teach parents how to respond to stressors in a healthier way in order to model for their children as well.
Thank you. So Reggie, if writing gun policy and legislation was completely up to you today, what are the 3 big things that you would include?
Sure. I want to take 2 minutes before I get into hopping to your question about some things that were previously said. One about gun violence and the media attention that it gets in an African American or Black community, and the lack of that comes. I don't think it's so much a lack of coverage. I think it's a different type of coverage that you get when you're talking about that, where the way that violence gets covered is different than when you had these mass shootings like we had in Aurora, what we had in Newtown. The way that they put that information out there about what happens is different. It's less about the people who were shot or the people who perished as a cause of that violence, and more this broader statement about Black people in violence or Black people in guns than what you get when you're talking about, there's this white kid who walked in this school and shot 15 people. It's a different sort of conversation that happens. I don't know that I would say that there's less of that happens. I think the emphasis and the intent of that conversation is just different. And then to your point about domestic violence, I don't think there's any community that really has an appropriate conversation about domestic violence. I think that's just something that all of us try to sweep under a table and pretend like it doesn't happen when it quite obviously does. To your question, 3 things that I would do. I certainly think that we have to, in terms of gun policy itself, or strictly speaking about gun policy, you do have to do things like limit the types of weapons that people can buy. I mean, you just can't have people going out and buying the same type of equipment for their personal use that people can get through service in the military armed forces. That just doesn't make sense. You know, there's just no reason why me as an enthusiast need to be able to go out and buy an M16. No need for it. That's just ridiculous. Less specifically about, or well, before I get into that, and you know, sort of again, common sense sort of things like background checks everywhere. You know, you can't just have people going anywhere and being able to buy guns through these different loopholes. Well, I went to this gun show and I can buy it without having to get a background check or what have you. Everybody, every time, every place, background check, plain and simple. Less specifically about guns and more just specifically about, or more generally in terms of policies that make sense that will help with things like gun violence is, you know, I came sort of late into a conversation, but, you know, moving towards having parity in terms of our mental health coverage. That's just, it's something that's necessary. You can't have these huge disparities that we have where folks can't get coverage or can't get the services that they need for mental health issues, and then live in a society where, like you said, there are millions of guns that are just laying around with all kinds of capacities for folks to do damage with those things. It just, you know, not to again point the finger at the mental health community or folks with mental illness and say that they're the problem, because they are not when it comes to gun violence. But that's something that makes for an easy scapegoat or an easy out for gun lobbyists or for the NRAs to say, well, you see, you've got all these people with mental health issues. If we didn't have these people with mental health issues, this problem would go away. And that gets into a whole other sort of healthcare conversation as well, but those would be the things that I would look at doing.
Yeah, I mean, I find it ironic that you know, the debate on the NRA type side is scapegoating to, you know, people as being mentally unstable, and that's the problem. But these are also the same people that almost certainly are not supporting any type of version of you know, adequate healthcare services in this country to deal with it. It's just, it's comical to me. You know, it's you hear it when they're talking about it. When they say mental health, let's be clear, they're not talking about actually improving mental health coverage. They want a database, and they want to not, you know, they want you to be locked up. So they don't actually understand mental health or healthcare services, period. It's just ironic and comical and sad that that's what's going on with some of this.
The thing that I love about that is that they want a database mental health folks, and they don't look at that as being a violation of their privacy or a violation of their rights.
Right, of course.
Not having a database of guns, we have the capacity to do serious amounts of violence to people. But no, oh wait, that's you're violating my privacy. You're trampling on my rights as a law-abiding citizen to, you know, do these things. Are these folks with mental health issues not law-abiding citizens? Are they not, you know, invested in the same rights of privacy that you are as the gun owner? How does that work?
Is this kind of cognitive dissonance a sign of mental illness?
You know, I want to tell you guys a story of something that happened here in Virginia. In Charlottesville, a guy, an older male, like maybe 55, white male, walks into Kroger, which is the grocery store, with an assault rifle, holding an assault rifle, okay? Cops come, the entire store freaks out, everybody's having nervous breakdowns. He was not intending on shooting anyone. He was simply making a statement about the Second Amendment and his right to carry a weapon. In Virginia, the law is you can have unconcealed weapons. Mad hysteria breaks out. I mean, if that's not a mental health issue right there, then I don't know what else.
He wasn't charged for anything, and Kroger in the end just banned him from the premise.
So he goes to the Kroger down the street. Okay, anyway, so we're at 9 o'clock. I want to close out by asking you all just for some closing thoughts, and to weave your closing thoughts together between the gun violence debate and the mental health and lack of mental health service debate. Mariam, let's start with you.
I think that we need to obviously focus on both of these issues. We need to, as was said before, we need to expand out mental health services and mental health coverage. And it is very frustrating that they are doing there are a lot of budget cuts in the health area, and access to mental health services is becoming a lot more limited. It's becoming harder for people to access mental health services, and that's something that we need to address and we need to fight for. And yeah, the guns, as was previously said, it's obvious that not all guns need to be out there, and we need to put a limit on people's access to it.
Kaiser, how about you?
Yeah, a lot of folks on the gun side of the debate talk about the Second Amendment. I think the conversation should start with the Declaration of Independence, which talks about life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And maybe that's the public safety, public health side of me. But really, we need to progress the conversation so that facts, figures actually make a difference. And I think you see too many people on the pro-gun side, or on the side that does not want to give more money for mental health or any sort of health coverage, that aren't swayed by statistics or facts or any quantitative reasoning. They're just beholden to principles. And I'm hoping that Newtown is a watershed moment in our history.
Fuad, how about you?
I think that it's ironic that these issues are being connected or attempted to be connected in the ways that folks are using it. I think that Reggie was right on when he's talked about the communities. The mental health debate is how you get around saying anything about race for these mass shootings. Yet mental health services are things that are particularly needed in low-income communities where there are a lot of stresses, and they're the ones that aren't getting these services. But I think that it might be a way for us to finally start actually discussing things like mental health services, but to not forget the role of socioeconomic status and race in terms of how the debate is being shaped, the parameters of what we're actually talking about, and just sort of how things get affected. Newtown got a lot of coverage for completely appropriate reasons. What was it yesterday? The girl in Chicago got shot that was performing at Obama's inauguration. It's like the 300th school-age child that's been killed in Chicago in the last 2 or 3 years. That hasn't received that much coverage, and and who's killed? It's folks who are, generally speaking, living in poor communities, minorities in this country, and it's a problem. And I think we really need to be cognizant of the role of race in terms of the debate and in terms of the issues in a proper way. Because it's clear that we need to provide real mental health services in this country, particularly to folks in particularly difficult and stressful situations, which we know have some sort of connection to issues sort of happening. Yeah.
Reggie, why don't you pull this up?
Yeah, to pick up on Fuad there, one of the things that I would say, particularly about mental health services, is that we have to look at how we're providing mental health services in different communities and making sure that the care that we're providing is culturally relevant and culturally competent to those communities. You can't take an approach or an intervention that works in one community and necessarily generalize that to work across all of them. You have to be able to work not only with but also in communities and figuring out how to best address those issues for members in those communities to be able to help folks and be able to get folks to actually utilize and engage in those types of services. You can go into here in New York, you can go to Upper East Side apartments or Upper West Side apartments, and everybody's happy to talk about having their therapist and what their therapist does for them and how many times a week that they go. You're not going to have that conversation in Brownsville, not just because they can't afford to have that therapist, but because of how that's particularly seen in that community and what that means for those folks in that community to have a therapist or to need to have a therapist. So beyond just looking at access to services, we also have to talk about how it is that we provide services and where we're providing those services to different communities. And then on the gun side, like as has been said, we really need to talk about where we want to be with gun ownership. Do we want to be a country where everyone owns a gun? Is that where we want to go? Is that what we want to have our place in the world be? Is that, we're that stereotypical Texan, big hat, big gun, no brains? Is that what we want? Is that the image that we want to put out there in the world? And if it is, then okay, then that's what we need to embrace. And then we also need to accept the fact then that we're going to have instances like Newtown and Aurora where, folks are going to just go and let loose with those sorts of things. If that's not the type of world that we want, if that's not the type of society that we want, then we need to look at how we regulate folks having access to guns, what that means, both from, as guys were saying, a public health perspective, what that means for us as a mental health sort of perspective, what that means for us, and overall sort of health, what that means for us, and then, of course, what that means for us in terms of our laws and our crime rates, and then, a safety perspective, what that means. But those aren't really conversations that we want to have in those particular ways. We just want to talk about the Second Amendment in this sort of general way that it means you can't take away my guns just because I want to have a gun, which is not what the Second Amendment says. It doesn't say anything about you actually being able to go out and buy M16s. But again, that's not a conversation that people want to have.
Thank you, all of you, for all your comments on that. I think the extreme sides of both debates that are being shown in the media right now are actually going to slowly be chipped away, and the more moderate voices and the people that are discussing the issues that Reggie is underscoring will start to come to the surface. And I have hope that those are the people that are ultimately going to lead the policy debate. A couple of folks that I saw on social media today chatting about the gun hearings were saying, these crazy extremist viewpoints are scaring the folks in the country who are not on those extremes. And perhaps that will entice them to speak up and speak out about being more brainy, for lack of a better term, when it comes to the debate. So I want to thank you all again for joining us. This has been There Is No Spoon's very first Google Hangout. Thank you for bearing with all the technical difficulties. And just as a reminder to all of our viewers, we had Mariam Khwaja from New York, Kaiser Hussein, and Fuad Pervez from Washington, D.C., Reggie Miller also from New York, and myself from an unnamed part of Virginia. Soon to be back in New York, hopefully. I will see you all very soon.